Well, welcome everyone to our August Che Alaska webinar. Thanks so much to our audience and guests for joining us today. Che Alaska, it's a program of Alaska Community Action on Toxics and the Collaborative for Health and Environment. And so these webinars, they're also part of Che's broader international coalition of over 5,000 individuals across the globe. My name is Nick Reardon. I work at ACAT, so based here in Anchorage, where I coordinate ACAT's community gardens and composting programs, and also occasionally help host these webinars. There's a steady drizzle outside at the moment, so I'm delighted to not be out in the gardens and to be joining you guys inside at the moment. Our guests today are Maureen Swanson, the Director of Environmental Risk Reduction in Project TENDR, Dr. Linda Birnbaum, a toxicologist and microbiologist, and a scholar in residence at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. And lastly, Dr. Carmen Marsit, professor in the Department of Environmental Health and Department of Epidemiology at Emory University. So thank you three so much for joining us. And the title of today's session is Protecting Children's Developing Brains, Hazards of Plastics and Toxic Chemicals in Plastics. And so our discussion is centered around a briefing paper recently published by Project TENDR. And I won't go into too much detail, but pass it on to our guests. So we'll start with presentations by Maureen Swanson and Dr. Birnbaum and Marsit, and then conclude our hour together with Q&A. So Zoom has a handy Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It's typically there'll be a button that says Q&A, and you can click that and type your questions directly in there. It doesn't interrupt anything. It doesn't distract. So you can do that at any time throughout the hour. You don't have to try to remember everything. Early and often is great with questions. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Maureen. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nick. Can you all see my screen?
It looks good to me.
All right. Well, I'm Maureen Swanson, and we'd like to thank Che and Che Alaska for this opportunity. We really appreciate the collaboration to help us promote our plastics briefing paper and share it with all of you, and then find connections and ways to work together. I will be introducing Project TENDR's work on the nexus of plastics, petrochemicals in plastics, and children's brain health. And then Dr. Birnbaum will be going through our briefing paper and presenting our findings and our recommendations. And then Dr. Marsit will present some of the most recent findings on plastics exposures and potential impacts to our health, as well as sharing some of Project TENDR's next steps around plastics and child brain development. Whoops, let's see. There we go. So Project TENDR is an alliance of more than 50 leading scientists, health professionals, and environmental health advocates who've come together with the purpose of protecting children's developing brains from neurotoxic chemicals and pollutants, and also from broader threats posed by climate change and by plastics production and pollution. Our scientists are at research universities and NIH children's health centers across the country. They're toxicologists, epidemiologists, and exposure scientists. Our health professionals include pediatricians, OBGYNs, neurologists, nurses, and midwives. We have representatives in Project TENDR from the National Medical Association, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the National Hispanic Medical Association, and others. And our advocates are often also scientists or health professionals or lawyers themselves, and they're advocates with ACAT, Alaska Community Action on Toxics, with Healthy Babies, Bright Futures, NRDC, Earth Justice, and EDF, to name a few. So we come together and we work to translate the scientific evidence. We summarize the scientific evidence and develop policy recommendations to prevent exposures and harm. And we seek to publish in peer-reviewed medical and scientific journals. This briefing paper is not a journal publication. Carmen will say a little bit about our next steps to do something for a journal, but it's a briefing paper that we put together ourselves. And we work with each of our publications to gain media coverage. We found that's a great way to come to the attention of the public and policymakers. And then we do a lot of we work together to hold meetings with federal agencies and decision makers to submit testimony and public comments, all toward influencing and informing policy change. And I wanted to just very briefly, you don't have to read through all these names, but that's our plastics work group. So it's just a nice snapshot of some of the breadth and depth of Project TENDR that I was just talking about. You know, you can see some of our scientists, you can see our health professionals, you can see some of our advocacy organizations. And so this is the group that came together to write the plastics briefing paper. And then a little bit about how we got engaged more fully on plastics. We've for a long time been working on and continue to have prioritized classes of neurotoxic chemicals in plastics, such as the phthalates and flame retardants and others. But our fall annual meetings are our opportunities to come together to plan and prioritize for the upcoming year. So in fall 2022, Pam Miller gave a compelling presentation and urged us to act as Project TENDR around plastics, neurotoxic chemicals in plastics, and child brain health. And we, after discussion, we reached a unanimous consensus decision to do that. We formed a work group, and we wrote and submitted a comment letter on EPA's proposed strategy to address plastics pollution. That was last summer, 2023. And then we held 2 intensive sessions as well as a breakout work group session at our fall 2023 Project TENDR meeting. And we decided, again, arrived at consensus that one of the best and most strategic things we could do next was to try to help inform the global treaty negotiations and our partner NGO efforts. So we issued that was in November 2023 that we decided to do a briefing paper. And so in the next 3 months, people really just, it was an amazing group effort to get a plastics briefing paper done and formatted and referenced and issued in April 2024. And we had that come out just before the 4th treaty negotiating session for the Global Plastics Treaty that took place in Ottawa. We disseminated the paper to the US State Department, EPA officials, all of the negotiators got a copy, and to partner NGOs in the United States and internationally. And we were helped with that dissemination effort just enormously by IPEN and Endocrine Society and CIEL and CHE. We held the United Nations Environment Program hosted a webinar that we gave on the briefing paper that was attended by more than 200 international participants in April. And now we are sharing a synopsis of the paper and the paper itself, again, with the negotiators who are involved in an intersession meeting at the end of August, focused on chemicals of concern in plastics. And then, of course, we're leading up to INC 5 in South Korea, I believe in November. Mm-hmm. And again, this is, we have been just delighted to work closely with IPEN, Endocrine Society, CIEL, CHE, and others to get the paper into the right hands. Now I'm going to turn it over to Linda Birnbaum, and Dr. Birnbaum will present the paper itself.
So this is really a pleasure for me to be able to do this. And I think that this was, as you've heard from Maureen, this was really an example of lots of people from different backgrounds putting their brains together and saying, plastics are a problem, and the harmful chemicals associated with plastics are a big part of that problem as well. And as Maureen said, the paper was really focusing on recommendations for essential policy reforms in the new Global Climate Treaty. Next slide, please. So I think many of you know that we are all exposed to plastic fragments. I think you know that the lovely statistics that we all poop out a credit card's worth of plastic every week. That doesn't really tell us how much we pee out, and it really doesn't tell us how much is still in our bodies. But we know that they are in our bodies now, and we're dealing both with nanoplastics and microparticles as well. There are thousands of chemical additives that are used in the production and development of plastics. And we know that some of them are very neurotoxic. So we know, for example, that phthalates, bisphenols, the flame retardants, especially the polybrominated diphenyl ether flame retardants, are known neurotoxicants. And there are major other clastics which are likely neurotoxicants, and some of us would probably say we believe that they are, such as some of the other organohalogen flame retardants in addition to the PBDEs. This whole substitution with organophosphate flame retardants, and we all know about organophosphate pesticides and their neurotoxicity. Chlorinated paraffins, which is a humongous class of chemicals that we're just beginning to pay attention to. And then PFAS, everything, everywhere, all of us. And again, a huge class of compounds. And we know that plastics act as vectors for directly delivering the neurotoxic chemicals, not into our brains, as well as the rest of our bodies. Next slide, please. So how do they get into us? Well, they're all inhaled and ingested and absorbed, and diet is the major source. The plastics leach chemicals, and especially plastic packaging, but in your food processing equipment, in your fast food, your epoxy resins and bottles, all can lead to exposure to things like phthalates, bisphenols, and I'm going to add PFAS here as well. Dust, again, plastic products are not inert. And since I should add, most of these chemical additives are not chemically bonded to the plastic backbones, but in fact are just mixed in. They do come out over time. So you have your plastic products that break down to give us dust, including flooring and building products, electronics. And again, can we go back a little bit? Thank you. And this includes, again, flame retardants, phthalates, PFAS again. And then you have the fact that incineration of plastics is a problem as well. And we've known for quite a long time that when you heat plastics to a certain temperature range, you generate polychlorinated and polybrominated dioxins and furans. Now, we also know that children tend to be more highly exposed than adults. And this part of it is related to their behavior, where they crawl around on the floor and they're constantly mouthing objects. But children also breathe, eat, and drink more relative to their size than adults do. Next slide. So plastic particles are, and the chemicals from them, we find them throughout the body. But our concerns at this point, we're focusing on the placenta. A recent study just this year found that, in fact, 60% of placental samples had plastic particles in 2006, 90% in 2013, and in less than 20 years, essentially every placenta that was looked at had plastic particles in it. You can find placenta particles, in meconium, the infant's first stool. You can find particles in breast milk, and you can find them in formula as well. And we know that plastic particles cross the blood-brain barrier. So our infants are all born pre-contaminated. with plastics and the chemicals associated with them. Now, what are some of the impacts on child brain development? Well, we know again that the plastic particles and their additives get through cell membranes and can impair placental function. And if you impair the placenta, you can affect fetal growth, you can affect brain growth and development, and you can affect the functioning of our neurological systems and altering behavior, motor function, learning, and memory. And we know that plastic particles were found in all placentas, especially of low-weight babies, and it was more of a problem, higher concentrations than normal weight babies. And we also know that babies that have higher microplastics exposure is associated with a lower birth weight, birth length and head circumference, and of growing concern, lower APGAR score. Next slide. So we have some overwhelming evidence for some classes of chemicals showing both prenatal and early childhood exposures can contribute to problems with brain development and neurodevelopmental disorders. And there's strong data for phthalates, PBD, flame retardants, and bisphenols, as well as, I would say, growing for other classes. But we know that these chemical classes and their substitutes leach from plastics into food and dust. We find them widely in pregnant women, infants, and children, and we know they pass to the fetus via the placenta and to the infant via breast milk and formula as well. Next slide. So let's a little more specifics about some of these classes. Why do we have phthalates everywhere? Because plastics are more durable and flexible. Some of us remember when they seemed like a miracle when they were first produced. Those of you who remember The Graduate remember the statement to Dustin Hoffman that all he had to do was think about plastics. We know that phthalates are used extensively in food packaging, production materials, personal care products, I should say pharmaceuticals, flooring and wall coverings. And as frequently happens, the youngest children are the most highly exposed. We also know that for many of the phthalates, especially something like DEHP, diet accounts for more than 50% of exposure in the US. And the prenatal exposures, the results of these prenatal exposures are impaired IQ, behavior, attention, and very linked to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. I think some of the important new data that's coming out is that these prenatal exposures are also associated with changes in brain structure. You can see changes in brain matter volumes using MRI approaches and the links to IQ deficits as well. And I have to say, while there's been concern for a long time with some of the older phthalates, the replacement phthalates that are now being approved also appear to harm child brain development. Next slide. Now, what about the organohalogen flame retardants? And I think much of the focus and what we know about these is based on the PBDEs. I mean, why do we have them? We have them, the OFRs were supposed to slow the rate of combustion by adding them to furniture, electronics, and materials to stop fires. They are associated with learning, behavioral, and intellectual impairment. And there's growing evidence that children on the autism spectrum may be more susceptible to harm. Now, PBDEs are listed in the Stockholm Convention, so they're basically banned internationally. And the US does restrict many of their uses, but they are still present in recycled plastic products and toys, food containers, older furniture, and certainly food handling utensils. Now, there are other brominated flame retardants, and OP flame retardants have replaced the PBDEs, and some of these are also showing harm to brain development and impacting fine motor skills, working memory, language abilities, behavior, and attention. Next slide, please. So the third class I'm going to focus on are the bisphenols, and we know these are huge production volume compounds that are used in polycarbonate plastics and epoxy resins. And although they were removed from baby bottles and sippy cups in 2010. They are still used extensively. The neurotoxicity of BPA, we have data both from rodent exposures showing impacts of exposure during pregnancy, infancy, or adolescence, being linked to deficits in memory and cognitive function. And these parallel what has been observed in epidemiological investigations, where showing BPA plays a role in ADHD, the autism spectrum, depression, anxiety, and cognitive disorders in children. Excuse me. And I think some of the greatest concern is, just like we saw with the flame retardants and with the phthalates, when we start studying the substitutes, the BPS, the BPF, the BPAF, and I could go on with the alphabet soup here, some of these may be worse. They may have greater impacts on child brain development than even BPA do. Next slide. So this is the whole issue of we need to prevent regrettable substitution. We know that emerging evidence shows replacement chemicals are just as or more neurotoxic than what gets phased out. And we find that these replacement chemicals in people have increased, including pregnant women and children. And I just am going to make a little aside here is somehow I think we're slow learners, because why can you just change one atom or maybe two atoms on a molecule and not have to change the process that you use or the product you generate? Why would we think that the biology would change? It's just an aside. Anyhow, it's really critical that we prevent harm to children's brain health by eliminating non-essential uses of plastics and harmful classes of chemicals, rather than trying to eliminate toxic chemicals one at a time. So this class approach is essential. So some of the recommendations that we have made to the Global Plastics Treaty is we've got to reduce and cap the plastics production and eliminate single-use plastics and non-essential uses. We have to phase out use of the most toxic plastic polymers, such as polyvinyl chloride and polystyrene. And we have to phase out the use of neurotoxic chemical classes in plastics. So we believe that government should start by immediately banning these chemical classes from plastic food contact materials, and that we have to ban classes of toxic additives in plastics, or we end up with regrettable substitution. Next slide. So we also strongly urge that there needs to be a ban on intentionally added nanoplastics and microplastics in products such as cosmetics, cleaning products, and toys. We really need full transparency and public disclosure of information. It's so hard to find out what's in products and knowing more about all the chemicals that are used in the production of plastics, as well as their additives. We have to really ensure that disposal and recycling of plastics doesn't result in release of toxic substances. And I think many of us are now realizing that recycling really doesn't work very well. Certainly, all too often, in the 15% of plastic that actually gets recycled, it often ends up with toxic substances present in it. And again, then we have to really work to prevent incineration of plastics, which is being promoted as chemical recycling and waste to energy schemes. In many cases, this generates more toxic chemicals. So recent data points on exposure, and I'm now going to turn this over to Carmen. Thank you, Carmen.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda. Yeah, I just wanted to point out, really just the dynamic nature of the research that's happening in the area of plastics and microplastics and nanoplastics. And much of it is focused still on trying to understand just how much exposure do people see to these little particles. And so this is data that's come out just since we released the briefing report this spring. And we see that there's been more research showing us that these particles are really in places that can be affecting children. So a study showed that various types of plastic particles were found in 30 different infant formulas from 6 different manufacturers in Europe. And so this is done in Europe. And so that really shows that these are broadly found in these kind of formulas that are feeding children. And animal models have shown that the kind of exposure levels that would be similar to what you might get out of these types of infant formula exposures do have impacts on health outcomes in those animals. So it is something I think that can be concerning. Exposures to these infants can also come from their bottles, their milk storage bags, and milk products. So it's really not only formulas that might be contaminated by these microplastics, but even breast milk has the potential to be contaminated. Of course, and Linda mentioned this earlier, children are really at great risk, partly because of how much they consume compared to their body size, but also because there are so many microplastics in dust and soil. And young children, because of their behaviors, tend to have greater risk of exposure. And there's more work coming out showing just how much of an exposure that potentially can be. Next slide, please. There's also a recent review that, again, is confirming the data, talking about the ability for these plastics to cross placental, blood-brain, and blood-testis barriers. So these microplastic and nanoplastic particles can be actively or passively transported across the placenta. So we're finding them in, research is finding them in the placenta, and it's likely that they are able to also move from the placenta into that developing fetus. And there's even a wider range of these particles that can cross the blood-brain barrier and enter neurons. And so it's really concerning to think about these particles carrying these toxic chemicals on them, being able to pass right into our neurons and really have those effects on those developing brains. Next, please. So just to say a little bit about where Project TENDR is going now. So right now we're, that same group that was working on this briefing paper is now taking that work and developing a commentary for submission into the scientific literature. Again, a lot of this is about just allowing us to broaden the reach and the audience that's seeing the work that we're doing and really trying to point out the importance of this issue. So we want to get more recognition of the dangers of plastic pollution and highlight the real need for actions that other scientists can also see just how important this issue can be. We also want to remind people that regulations work, and so that when good regulations are put into place, they can help people reduce exposures and they can improve health. And so it's important that when we talk about these issues, that we remind people that regulations are important and can be helpful. We also want to gain broader press coverage of this topic and continue to call for the plastic treaty to address these health impacts. And we think by having this broader coverage, there could be more pressure to be pushing towards moving toward a really useful treaty. And this is also a way that we can advocate with policymakers to prevent the proliferation and toxicity of plastics. We see how many different places these plastics can be. We see all the different ways in which they get into the environment. And so we really want to do what we can by working with policymakers to prevent that. And so, really we're calling for this strong plastics treaty that really can protect the health of children's developing brains by reducing the production and the use of plastics, and that hope that subsequent generations won't have to be exposed to all of these plastic particles and hopefully be preventing these types of harmful effects that can affect children really throughout their entire life. And we do have a link here for that briefing, and are happy to share that briefing as well. And I think we're now open to questions. So,
yeah, Nick, should we turn things back over to you, or did?
I'd say, yeah, let's do Q&A, Maureen, if you're willing to moderate.
Do we want to? Should I stop sharing or leave the slides up? Do we think? I don't know if people will want to.
Yeah, maybe stop sharing. And we can bring the slides back up if needed for a particular question.
Absolutely. Let me look.
I can start with the first one that I see there around, what about products made with fleece, like stuffed animals and blankets? And that is certainly a source of potential exposures for children. So children's toys, stuffed animals, many of those fabrics that are used to make those stuffed animals are some form of a plastic product or rayon or other fibrous plastics, and so that is a definite source because those fibers do break off of those products.
Well, we also know the polyurethane foam, which is obviously plastic. huge amounts of flame retardants were used in the polyurethane foam. And in fact, most of it didn't work very well at actually preventing fires, because the flame retardants work when you can get up to about 50% by weight of flame retardant in the product. And usually they're used at about 1%. So it doesn't really do much. Now, the use of some of that has decreased, but they're still there.
Wow. The next question is about, let's see, mentions that people are self-canning in glass to prevent BPA-lined can exposures. And did we mention the plastics in the canning lids, which we do mention some of the BPA-lined cans in the briefing paper, but I don't think we mentioned canning lids. And apparently there's a 1996 breast cancer test tube study. I don't know, Carmen or Linda, if there's anything.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it certainly could be another source of exposure. I mean, you do think about those kind of soft plastic bottoms to canning lids there are BPA, because they're kind of that flexible materials. They may be using different substitutes now, but again.
I think there are times though where we have to be pragmatic. How much better to store in glass, even if the lid has a little bit of something bad in it, compared to storing the whole thing in plastic. So I think clearly we'd like to develop or to know about other options that might not have any plastic or chemical contamination present. But I'll take the good even if it's not the perfect.
Exactly.
And the question, are there efforts to reach the public directly and start the change from the bottom up, instead of hoping for a government response first? So just speaking for Project TENDR, yes, that's part of what we do. And that's the prong of trying to get media attention. We found that reaches the public directly so much better if we can land some coverage in by CNN or the New York Times or NPR or any of those national media outlets that then translate into hundreds of state and local media outlets. So that's one way that we try to reach and kind of galvanize the public directly. I know other nonprofits are also working on that front.
And I think a lot of us, even the individuals within Project TENDR, do a lot to try to, share these stories and share this information in different formats, maybe through our institutions or through groups that we work with, to also get this out there, through media or other channels where people can try to learn more about these challenges and advocate for themselves, really to bring this kind of data to people to allow them to be able to be their own advocates.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. So the question, it's been my understanding that the plastics industry has been able to get a seat at the table for the UN treaty discussions where they previously had been excluded. How is that being addressed? So unfortunately, our Pam Miller with ACAT and IPEN is just an amazing leader within Project TENDR and has a lot of expertise on the treaty negotiations themselves, along with many others. We've worked with Bjorn Bieler at IPEN. So Pam was just updating us recently in Project TENDR that this is indeed the case. The plastics industry not only has a seat at the table, they've gotten more of a seat at the table, is my understanding. And this intersession meeting that's coming up in late August, that is to be focused on chemicals of concern in plastics, has been a little bit co-opted by industry representatives and negotiators. It's all negotiators, and the treaty leaders have made a decision to keep observers out of that meeting. So my understanding is that IPEN and ACAT and many others involved from the NGO side have been rigorously protesting that decision and trying to get a seat again at that table. Vina, and Vina asks, what has been the reception for the briefing paper and recommendations? Any sense of impact on the treaty negotiations? Well, so that's a great question. The briefing paper, our slides that we presented as part of the UN Environment Program webinar have been widely requested. We know we got responses that that people have our slides at the State Department and are looking at them. Part of Project TENDR's next steps are to identify key decision makers who would be willing to meet with us so that we can get this information on health impacts and brain health impacts in front of them. We did have some folks from the Canadian government after our webinar in April have asked if they could meet with some of our scientists because they're working on some of those chemical classes and they don't have the scientific evidence information right now on the health impacts. So we are setting up a meeting with those, with the Canadian government agency. And then on a, kind of from the macro to the micro level, there's an NGO in California who got in touch with me and said, oh, this paper is helping us to advocate within our school district to stop using plastic utensils in the cafeteria. So a wide range of kind of starting impacts, but we're just at the beginning of this effort, and we really hope to help inform and influence the decision makers at all levels. Okay. Then I see, oh, this is, thank you. Diane Wilkie is saying that the California Department of Toxic Substances Control will be holding a webinar August 27th on chemicals of concern in synthetic turf. And some of you may have seen the study out on the Philadelphia Eagles players that they studied the artificial turf in the formal Philadelphia Eagles sports stadium, football stadium, and found high levels of PFAS in those, all of those samples. And at least half a dozen former Philadelphia Eagles football players have died of a rare and aggressive brain cancer, and they believe there's a link to that. Carmen or Linda, would you want to say a few words? Somebody else is asking about synthetic turf.
I think there's growing concern and there's growing interest. Synthetic turf involves lots of plastic. It also involves lots of synthetic rubber. I mean, that's where a lot of old rubber tires go. So in addition to some of the kind of chemicals we've mentioned, also can include elevated metal levels. I think the issues with synthetic turf are especially concerning when it's used indoors, in kids' playgrounds. When it's used outdoors, at least the volatile things that are present in the synthetic turf will, after a little while, basically volatilize and not be as much of an issue. But indoor, you're going to have all the volatiles plus lots of concentration of the synthetic, the chemicals that are used. And again, the whole issue with so much of this stuff is that things are not covalently bonded to the matrix. And so they come out over time. Carmen?
Yeah, I would just completely agree with that. And I think the other thing that we're learning a lot about synthetic turf is also the heat effects of synthetic turf when it is outside, that it's much more of a heat source, in urban areas, for example. And so maybe a real problem with heat islands and continuing to affect sort of local temperatures. And so it's also a problem for thinking about climate resilience.
Thank you. And just I was remiss going back to Vina's question about our how we hope to have the briefing paper impact policy efforts and decisions. That's, as Carmen mentioned, that's one reason we're also looking toward doing a commentary for the peer-reviewed published literature, because that will reach yet another audience and continue to kind of amplify and not just the research, but the credibility of the research. So that will help. Please comment on FDA's new conclusion that current scientific evidence does not demonstrate that levels of microplastics or nanoplastics detected in foods pose a risk to human health. So we disagree with that. We have been working for a number of years now to try and get FDA to act on neurotoxic chemicals in food, and particularly we've focused on phthalates in food contact materials, and have had some are in the midst of ongoing meetings and work to get FDA to act on phthalates, as well as other plastics and toxic additives to plastics in food. And as Linda mentioned, phthalates are for phthalates, dietary exposures are a main source of exposure. So,
I
Linda?
just wanted to, I wanted to mention, for those of you who may not be aware of it, that FDA is undergoing a major reorganization for establishing a unified human food program. It's really aimed at enhancing the agency's ability to oversee and protect food supply, improve access to safe and nutritious food, and enhance understanding of chemical safety and nutrition. So I think I'm guardedly optimistic that we may soon have an FDA more responsive to issues of food additives, food supplements, and contamination in food.
Thank you, Linda. And has there been characterization of what chemicals are most commonly found attached to micro and nanoplastics? Carmen or Linda, would you?
Yeah, I mean, I think as many of the classes that Linda had talked about in her half of the presentation. I mean, the phthalates, BPAs. I mean, anything you really can think about that's in a plastic container, and the linings of those containers or might be combined into those plastics, the flame retardants, they're all there, right? And again, they're not bound in. So as those plastics break down into these microparticles, those chemicals are getting released, or they're staying kind of holding on to those microparticles. And then the real danger there is that those microparticles can be transported into the body and directly into cells because of their size, where you're now really delivering these chemicals directly into a cell where it can do real damage.
Thank you. And state policy or advocacy opportunities for reducing exposures. Are there state policy or advocacy opportunities? What are they? And then are there equity and environmental justice considerations when thinking about microplastics and PFAS? And
absolutely. Absolutely.
Go ahead, Linda, with that.
I'm sorry. Often our most challenged populations, and challenging can be economic, it can be where they're located, it can be related to racial or ethnic differences, turn out often to be the most highly exposed to all of these compounds. And some of it's related to, what they, the kinds of things that they use or where they live and so on. So the social disparities issues is huge in this context. But the other issue about state, and Maureen, I'm sorry, you probably can comment more, but if it weren't for our states moving us ahead, we'd often be in big trouble. The federal government is very slow, but if California, regulates something, nobody wants to make something they can't sell in the 5th largest economy in the world.
Yeah, and
I would even say that goes even to the local level, right? If you think about it, I mean, that's where people, I think, often have some of the greatest impact, working with your local policymakers. We see plastic bag bans, right, in communities and things like that, which feel like a small thing, but actually can have a really big effect, right? And that really is reducing, these plastics and the need for them. And so I think thinking about even those small steps are really important, starting at the local level and then moving upward.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a big part of our dissemination strategy, is to get this information into the hands of organizations that can then use it at whatever level they're working at. And we really had such a great deal of help from folks in some of the organizations I mentioned and others, IPEN and CIEL and ACAT, and people who got us lists of scientists and NGOs and all sorts of folks working in this space. And then we got them the plastics briefing paper. And then a few times people on those lists came back to me and said, is it okay if I share it with my list over here? And that's just what we want to have happen. So we keep working to, to help inform and share the evidence on this piece of the plastics harm. Let's see. Have you reached American pediatricians? When, and are there replies? That's on our list, but we worked with the American Academy of Pediatrics most recently earlier this year on some initiatives around pesticides. And so we have good relationships there with AAP, and we will be working with them as well on these issues of plastics. We also have pediatricians involved with Project TENDR who are taking this information out in their own professional circles and conferences. How do you make the case for reducing plastics production with governments, especially oil producers like the US? Well, that's a big question. I think to me, it's so important to make the health case that this isn't just about it's bad enough that it's clogging the oceans and harming wildlife and changing ecosystems and contributing increasingly to climate change, but it's affecting our health. And as Linda and Carmen pointed out, it's starting in utero. I mean, it's just horrific to think that babies are born with plastics in their brains and bodies. Carmen and Linda, do you have any?
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, that tends to be the strongest case that we try to make is just really for people to understand these affect health, and these affect health of the most susceptible populations, right? These are, infants and children who really don't have a choice in getting this exposure. And so unless we can do things to reduce that exposure out there and put policies into place that allow for that reduction, there's almost no way we can really ever prevent them from being exposed.
And what happens developmentally is usually irreversible. And I think that's an important thing to stress.
Yeah. Let's see. Is there federal or state legislation focused on restricting the proliferation of plastic and additives in food packaging and other products, and or banning existing products? Well,
there's certainly federal legislation hasn't gone anywhere with banning some of the chemicals that we've been talking about. Maureen, you may know more specifics about certain of the use I should say some of those bills are focused on specific kinds of plastics or specific kinds of products. Maureen, you may be able to address that better.
I think that was well put. Senator Feinstein's office had been very she had championed work around phthalates and other toxic chemicals in plastics and especially around food contact materials. But we're working with Senator Markey's office because he's interested in doing the same. So far, we haven't had big wins, but and I know many others of you are working on the same issues. So we keep making those connections with each other and collectively demanding change. Let's see, some effects of prominent chemicals in plastics like phthalates or BPA are known. To date, the effects that can be attributed to the particles themselves are not well known. What is your thinking regarding the particles effects?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a really outstanding question. I mean, we don't know a lot about that. Part of it is it's been hard to measure these particles until pretty recently, right? I mean, you're really looking at, tiny little microscopic particles. And so the only way to know how much you're seeing and what kind of exposures you're getting are really to get them out of some type of biological sample or environmental sample and look at them and count them, right? I mean, it really gets down to, now some very high-tech, microscopy techniques but that's how we have to measure them. And when you think about those kinds of challenges in just even measuring these, that makes it harder to study, right? Because it's to try to apply those kinds of measurement techniques in big studies of people, I think are really challenging. But I think it's something people are starting to think about. And what we do know about nanomaterials, nanoplastics, microplastics, is this ability for them to cross into cells. And I think that's really where I think some of the real toxicity can be, is they can be carriers, right? They can really bring these toxic chemicals right into the cell. And so there's, it's really delivering toxic chemicals, right to where it can do the most damage.
I think there is some data beginning to emerge from the ecological realm of the actual particles themselves, not the additives, that they can also certainly be irritating, and that there is some evidence for them causing adverse effects.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to, there's some helpful information in the Q&A chat, but there's a question: how far along is the plastics treaty? Can it still be improved? I heard they were moving fast on this. So I will just relay what Pam just told us. She just updated us on this, but please, if you'd reach out to Pam Miller at ACAT or others who are engaged in person in the plastics treaty negotiations, she has a great expertise. But so the plastics, the fifth negotiating session is being held in November, and then they are supposed to be revising language of a treaty. And then in 2025, Pam noted that they're supposed to be getting to a place in 2025 where they could adopt a treaty. Our colleagues at CIEL, Center for International Environmental Law, have said that if they move that fast on it, that's a problem for all of us, because it won't be good. They don't have health considerations addressed at all. So I think the hope is that it will be slowed down and that it can be, vastly improved and not be kind of an industry perspective captured in a treaty. I don't know if there's others who have any insights on that, but so Pam was saying they are ostensibly set to move quickly, but I think many of the observers from the US and internationally are hoping to slow things down so that the content can be a lot better. Let's see.
And then there's a question here kind of around, how good are we at doing this, right? And so how good are the controls when we're measuring these microparticles? And I think absolutely that can be a concern. I mean, I think, I think there's better work coming out more recently that is doing a better job of thinking about those kinds of controls. How do we make sure that we're using clean rooms and putting the right measures in place to assure that what we're measuring really is the contaminants and not just background measures of what's floating around in a lab where it's happening. But that can be a real problem. And so I do think really careful work has to be done, which is again part of the challenge of really being able to study these things.
Yeah, thank you, Carmen. Let's see. From a layperson's perspective, given the presence of many kinds of plastics and even toxins beyond plastics in products in the environment, how do I avoid being overwhelmed with this information and still be proactive in reducing exposures?
I'll take a stab at that. As I said before, you don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Do what you can, do what you've learned that can make sense for you to do. Those will be improvements. Have concern about, I would say, the children or the pregnant women. And actually, we shouldn't forget the soon-to-be fathers, because we know dads matter too. And we know that things can impact the man, which can then have impacts on the offspring. So people will often say to me, well, what can you do? And I'll say, well, don't heat in plastic. Simple. simple thing to do, which can reduce some of your exposures. But that's just an example. And also, I'm, not as concerned with somebody of my age, although maybe that's why I aged, as I would be, for example, with my grandchildren, for example, and their kinds of exposures. So, I think that we need some societal change to come about here, where we start talking about what do we really need instead of what do we have or what do we want. Because the more we learn, we find that many of the things that have been synthesized over the last 70 years turn out to be problematic for our health and for the environment.
Thank you, Linda. And then a question on children's clothing. Is clothing considered an exposure issue?
Certainly for some of these chemicals, it can be. If we talk about PFAS have been used to be stain protective, for example, or water repellent that's been used on clothing. Certainly there have been times where fire retardants have been used in children's clothing. I mean, the first time this issue was raised in the 70s, when it was shown that two flame retardants, one brominated, one chlorinated, were in kids' pajamas, and they were associated with high levels of mutagenicity and then carcinogenicity in rodents. So I think that's, clothing can be a route of exposure. Plus, a lot of clothing has plastics inherently in it.
Okay. Rachel was asking about, are we able to construct an informal hierarchy of threats to neurodevelopment? Do you feel there's one type of exposure that could overshadow the others in importance? We haven't done that. We do try to prioritize. For example, we are working on a lot of, we have a lot of work underway in Project TENDR around different chemicals and metals in food. We've commented a lot. We're holding meetings. We are working with congressional offices who are engaged to try and have them play a role and take action. So I think diet is a main exposure source for many of these plastics and chemicals in plastics, but it's certainly not the only area we need to be paying attention to.
Maureen, I just want to say, I think that is a great question and something that we attenders should begin to look at and see if we can come up with kind of an approach for where do we think we've got the most problems or the greatest risk.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. Another question, which I think might have been answered already, about exposure through clothing absorption. Let's see. I do believe, I'll get back to Susan's question, but this is being recorded, right, Nick? Yes. And thank you, everybody who's not only attending, but has been saying they'll be sharing the presentation. And to Susan's question of how you get involved, if there's a local group that you're part of that that would find this information useful. We tried to, for our briefing paper, we worked hard to aim for an educated but non-scientific audience in how we wrote it, so that we could reach more people with the information. Let's see. We have speakers that can participate in local education with grassroots groups. We actually, in Project TENDR, just completed our Project TENDR Experts Guide, and it's got a majority of the folks in Project TENDR, and we are now, we have to get that disseminated. We just finished it, so we will be, it's very user-friendly. Christy Ellickson in Project TENDR did a fantastic job of making it an easily searchable online tool. So we will be getting that out, and then you can search by chemical or issue of concern. You can search by person. You can search by geography. So we hope that will be a help in connecting some of our experts with local organizations, and especially environmental justice and community groups where we could serve as allies. Let's see. So there's a couple different questions here. I know we're at time. I don't know if should we go ahead, Nick, with a few more?
I want to respect your guys' time and the audience's time. So there's so many, these questions are amazing. I feel like I'm learning a lot, and it's really inspiring to hear your guys' comments to them. Yeah, I mean, I don't need to go anywhere, but I really want to thank you guys for everything you've contributed here today. And I'm so glad we have this recorded. Do you have any thoughts or final comments, or if you wanted to pick a question to end on or anything like that?
I think it's important, Maureen, that we, have all those questions that we following this can look at, and I think it may provide some good suggestions for us for some further, not only work, but some further communications.
Yes. Nick, are we able to copy the questions so we can have them for later?
Yeah, definitely. I can compile them and send a list to you guys.
No, thank you. And yeah, I think in conclusion, I will say, I think plastics is such a visible problem, and plastics production, plastics use, plastics pollution. And I do feel hopeful in that everybody I talk to, from, older family members to my college aged children, and everybody sees this concern. We already know it's a problem, and so now I think we have to help people understand the serious health consequences, and then maybe what we can all help do about it. So, well, thank you so much, Nick and Sarah, everybody at CHE and CHE Alaska, for this opportunity.
Yeah, I really appreciate you guys sharing with us the clarity and the insight. It's inspiring and really helpful. And thanks to everyone who joined. The next CHE Alaska will actually be on artificial turf related to plastic pollution and PFAS. So I saw that, quite a few questions on that topic came up September 18th, and there'll be an email coming out about that with an invitation and some resources. So signing off. Yeah, thanks again. And Maureen, thanks for facilitating the Q&A and all that. And
so many great questions.
I will work to get this recording live on our website and out via an email, along with any other resources that came up, and get that list of additional questions to you guys. Thanks again, everyone. Till next time.
Bye-bye. Thank you.